As of February 2025, the world is closely watching the shifting dynamics of U.S. foreign policy. And one of the most pressing concerns is, what happens if Trump cuts Ukraine aid? With billions of dollars in military and economic support at stake, such a decision wouldn't just impact Ukraine. It could send shockwaves across multiple nations, destabilizing alliances, economies, and regional security. For many countries, U.S. assistance to Ukraine has been a strategic lifeline, deterring Russian aggression and maintaining balance in Eastern Europe. A sudden halt in aid could force allies to rethink their security policies, increase military spending, or even reconsider their alliances. According to a recent report by the RAND Corporation, the potential consequences of reducing support could range from increased conflict risks to economic downturns in key regions. Today on Globe Discoveries, we're counting down 10 countries that could be significantly affected if the U.S. reduces or eliminates Ukraine aid. Could this shift alter the global balance of power? Let's take a closer look. Number 10. Poland. Poland has been one of Ukraine's most staunch supporters, providing military aid, weapons, and humanitarian assistance since the war began. The Polish government has spent over $4 billion in military and economic support, a figure that has steadily increased over the past 2 years. However, if the U.S. pulls back its support, Poland could be forced to shoulder an even heavier burden, leading to economic strain and increased domestic tensions. Security is another pressing concern. Poland shares a 310-mile border with Ukraine and has long viewed Russian aggression as a direct threat to its sovereignty. According to the Polish Ministry of Defense, a reduction in U.S. aid to Ukraine could lead to a destabilized Eastern Europe, forcing Poland to significantly boost its own military spending and readiness. Economically, Poland has already absorbed millions of Ukrainian refugees, placing pressure on housing, education, and healthcare systems. A weakening Ukraine would likely lead to another wave of displaced people, exacerbating Poland's internal struggles. The Polish government has already signaled concerns about limited EU financial assistance and whether it can sustain its level of support without U.S. involvement. Diplomatically, Poland would likely push NATO and the EU to increase military commitments in the region. But without the United States leading the charge, European nations could struggle to match Washington's previous level of involvement. Poland has been working on building its own military strength, but it still relies on U.S. intelligence, logistical support, and advanced weaponry to secure its borders. Unless new security guarantees are put in place, Poland could find itself in an increasingly vulnerable position, both economically and militarily, if U.S. support for Ukraine weakens. Number 9. Germany. Germany has been a key supporter of Ukraine, providing billions of dollars in military aid, weapons, and humanitarian support since the start of the war. If the U.S. were to cut its funding, Germany would face increased pressure to fill the financial and military gap, potentially stretching its resources beyond sustainable levels. According to Deutsche Welle, Germany has already committed over $17 billion in aid, and further increases could strain its economy. Without the U.S. leading the charge, Germany may struggle to maintain European unity on Ukraine, as some EU nations are hesitant to increase their financial commitments. Berlin has worked closely with Washington on military coordination, and a reduction in U.S. involvement could leave Germany shouldering a disproportionate share of European defense. This could spark internal political divisions, as some German lawmakers argue that Germany is already contributing more than its fair share. Economically, Germany has been absorbing Ukrainian refugees, placing a significant burden on social services, housing, and infrastructure. With an estimated 1.1 million Ukrainians living in Germany, a weakened Ukraine could drive another wave of displacement, increasing economic strain. Additionally, Germany's heavy reliance on Russian energy before the war has forced it to revamp its energy policies, making it more vulnerable to geopolitical shifts. A decrease in U.S. aid to Ukraine could also embolden Russia, forcing Germany to ramp up its own military spending. While Germany has pledged to strengthen its defense budget, some experts warned that it is still lagging behind NATO commitments. Without U.S. leadership, Germany's security strategy could face serious setbacks. If Washington significantly reduces its role in Ukraine, Germany may find itself having to take on a leadership role in European defense, whether it is ready or not. Number 8. United Kingdom. The United Kingdom has been one of Ukraine's strongest backers, providing both military training and advanced weaponry. However, if the U.S. cuts its financial aid, the UK could find itself under pressure to expand its support. something that may not be feasible given its own economic struggles. According to The Guardian, the UK has already spent over $6.5 billion on Ukraine aid, and additional funding could lead to budget cuts in other critical areas. British military officials have warned that without US support, Ukraine's defensive capabilities would be severely weakened, requiring European nations to step up in ways they may not be prepared for. The UK has provided long-range missiles, tanks, and intelligence support, but it lacks the financial muscle to compensate for the loss of billions in US aid. If American funding stops, Ukraine's military stockpiles could diminish rapidly, forcing the UK to rethink its own contributions. Domestically, increased aid to Ukraine could further divide British politics, as some argue that funds should be redirected to domestic economic recovery efforts. Inflation and energy costs have risen sharply in the UK, and spending billions more on foreign conflicts may not sit well with the British public. According to BBC News, a growing percentage of British citizens believe their government has already done enough for Ukraine. Beyond financial concerns, the UK has worked closely with NATO and the US in intelligence sharing and military coordination. A sudden shift in US policy could disrupt that structure, forcing the UK to adjust its defense and diplomatic strategies accordingly. Without American involvement, London's ability to maintain security commitments in both Ukraine and its other global operations could be severely challenged. While the UK is unlikely to abandon Ukraine altogether, it may not have the resources to maintain its current level of support if the US steps back. If that happens, Ukraine could lose one of its strongest military backers, leaving the country more vulnerable than ever. Number 7. France. France has positioned itself as a key European power in supporting Ukraine, providing advanced military aid, humanitarian assistance, and diplomatic backing. If the US cuts its financial support, France could face increased pressure to expand its military contributions, a move that could strain its defense budget and political landscape. According to Le Monde, France has committed over $4 billion in aid to Ukraine, but replacing US funding would require a dramatic shift in policy. French President Emmanuel Macron has been one of Ukraine's strongest European allies, but public support for continued involvement is wavering. Recent polls indicate that a growing number of French citizens are questioning whether France should bear more of the financial and military burden if the US steps back. With economic struggles at home, including high inflation and ongoing protests over pension reforms, many argue that further commitments to Ukraine could stir domestic unrest. A reduced US role in Ukraine could also weaken NATO's cohesion, forcing France to rethink its broader defense commitments. Paris has long pushed for a stronger European-led defense initiative, but without American leadership, the financial strain on European nations may make that vision harder to achieve. Beyond military aid, France has provided humanitarian and economic assistance, helping to house Ukrainian refugees and support infrastructure rebuilding efforts. However, if US funding is cut, Ukraine's recovery could slow significantly, leaving France and its EU partners to pick up the slack. Without the US leading the charge, France could face tough political and financial decisions in determining how much more it can realistically contribute to Ukraine's fight. Whether Macron can rally continued public and parliamentary support remains an open question. Number 6. Canada. Canada has been one of Ukraine's most vocal supporters, contributing over $9 billion in military, economic, and humanitarian aid since the start of the war. However, if the US scales back its contributions, Canada would struggle to match the financial gap, putting Ukraine's war effort at risk. According to CBC News, Canadian defense officials have warned that without American leadership, Ukraine's ability to resist Russian advances could weaken significantly. One of the biggest concerns for Canada is the impact on NATO coordination. The US has played a critical role in intelligence sharing, logistics, and military strategy, and if Washington shifts its focus, Canada would need to reassess its own defense policies. With rising tensions and global hotspots like the Arctic and Indo-Pacific, Ottawa might be forced to redirect resources away from Ukraine, creating further challenges for Kyiv. Domestically, Canada has also felt the economic effects of supporting Ukraine, particularly as inflation and cost of living concerns grow. A significant portion of the Canadian public supports aid for Ukraine, but there are increasing calls for the government to focus more on domestic issues like healthcare and housing. If the US cuts its aid, Canada may face political pressure to limit further spending on Ukraine. Another major issue is Ukraine's large refugee population in Canada. Since 2022, over 250,000 Ukrainians have resettled in Canada, placing added pressure on public services and social infrastructure. If conditions in Ukraine worsen due to decreased U.S. support, Canada may need to expand refugee assistance programs, further straining government resources. If the U.S. steps back, Canada's role in supporting Ukraine could be significantly tested, forcing tough decisions on military spending, refugee support, and global defense commitments. The question remains, can Canada maintain its level of support without U.S. leadership? Number 5. Lithuania. Lithuania has been one of the most vocal European supporters of Ukraine, contributing military aid, training, and humanitarian relief since the start of the war. However, if the U.S. were to cut its financial and military support, Lithuania would be forced to reevaluate its own security policies, as the threat of Russian aggression remains a top concern. According to the Baltic Times, Lithuania has already increased its defense budget to a record high. But without U.S. leadership, it may have to invest even more. Lithuania, along with other Baltic states, relies heavily on NATO's collective defense, particularly U.S. military presence in the region. If Washington reduces its commitment to Ukraine, some analysts fear that NATO's overall response to potential Russian threats in the Baltics could weaken. This could leave Lithuania feeling more vulnerable, pushing it to seek stronger defense commitments from European allies. Aside from security concerns, Lithuania has also absorbed a large number of Ukrainian refugees, adding pressure to its housing, labor market, and public services. While the government has been supportive of Ukraine, a prolonged conflict with reduced U.S. support could force Lithuania to scale back financial assistance to its growing refugee population. The economic consequences of a weakened Ukraine would also be felt in Lithuania. The country has strong trade and energy ties with Kyiv, and any setbacks in Ukraine's economy could disrupt Lithuanian markets. If U.S. support dwindles, Lithuania may be forced to adjust its foreign policy strategy, relying more on EU defense initiatives and regional cooperation to counter security threats. Number 4. Japan. Japan has been one of Ukraine's most consistent non-European allies, providing economic aid, imposing sanctions on Russia, and supplying non-lethal military support. If the U.S. scales back its commitment, Japan could find itself in a difficult position, as it would need to balance its alliance with the West while managing its own regional security threats from China and North Korea. According to the Japan Times, Tokyo has pledged over $7 billion in aid to Ukraine, but extending that level of support would become increasingly difficult without U.S. backing. Japan has already strengthened its defense partnerships with NATO and the U.S., recognizing that a weakened Ukraine could embolden authoritarian regimes worldwide, particularly in Asia. If American involvement in Ukraine declines, Japan could be forced to ramp up its own defense spending, something it has been hesitant to do for decades. The Japanese government has also been concerned about the economic consequences of prolonged conflict in Ukraine. Rising energy costs and global supply chain disruptions have already impacted Japan's economy, and further instability in Eastern Europe could exacerbate inflation and trade imbalances. Additionally, Japan's security strategy relies heavily on U.S. military presence in the Indo-Pacific. If Washington shifts focus away from global commitments, Japan may have to expand its own military capabilities, a move that could spark domestic political debate. If U.S. aid to Ukraine is significantly reduced, Japan may face tough choices regarding its foreign policy, balancing its commitment to Ukraine with its own pressing regional security concerns. Number 3. Estonia. Estonia has been one of the most outspoken defenders of Ukraine, committing a significant percentage of its GDP to military aid. If the U.S. scales back its support, Estonia could face increased security risks, as it shares a border with Russia and has long feared potential aggression. According to the Estonian Ministry of Defense, the country has spent over $500 million on Ukrainian aid, a substantial amount for a small nation. One of the biggest concerns for Estonia is that a weaker Ukraine could embolden Russia, making the Baltic states the next potential targets for destabilization. Estonia is a NATO member, but without strong U.S. leadership, NATO's deterrent strategy in the region could be weakened. This would force Estonia to increase defense spending and strengthen its alliances with other European nations. Beyond military concerns, Estonia has also taken in tens of thousands of Ukrainian refugees, placing strain on housing, public services, and education. Estonia's economy is closely tied to Ukraine through trade, energy, and cybersecurity cooperation. According to Euronews, Estonia has already experienced several Russian cyberattacks, and a weakened Ukraine could make these threats more frequent. Without strong American backing, Estonia would have to rely more heavily on EU security initiatives and bolster its own military capabilities. But whether it can fully defend itself without US leadership remains an open question. Number 2. Taiwan. While Taiwan is not directly involved in the Ukraine conflict, the outcome of the war is closely watched by both Taiwan and China. If the US reduces aid to Ukraine, many fear it could signal a weakening of US commitments to its allies, making Taiwan more vulnerable to potential aggression from China. According to the South China Morning Post, Taiwanese officials believe that how the US handles Ukraine will set a precedent for future military conflicts. A lack of US support for Ukraine could embolden China to take more aggressive actions in the Taiwan Strait, testing Washington's willingness to intervene in potential conflicts. Taiwan has already seen increased Chinese military exercises near its borders, and analysts warn that a distracted or hesitant US could shift the balance of power in Beijing's favor. Taiwan has also been a strong supporter of Ukraine, providing financial assistance, semiconductor technology, and humanitarian aid. Domestically, Taiwan's government has been pushing for stronger military preparedness, but its defense strategy relies heavily on US intelligence, weapons, and military coordination. Taiwan's future remains uncertain, but if the US cuts aid to Ukraine, it could trigger a domino effect in global security, making it one of the most affected nations outside of Europe. The question remains, will America's stance on Ukraine impact its commitments elsewhere? Number 1. Ukraine. Unsurprisingly, the country that would be most directly impacted by a US aid cut is Ukraine itself. Since the start of the war, Ukraine has relied heavily on billions of dollars in military, economic, and humanitarian support from the United States. According to the Kyiv Independent, US aid has funded weapons systems, intelligence operations, and direct financial assistance that have kept Ukraine's war effort alive. One of the most immediate effects of reduced US aid would be a shortage of advanced weaponry and ammunition. Ukrainian forces have used US-supplied HIMARS, Patriot missile systems, and Abrams tanks to hold the front lines. If aid is cut, Ukraine may be unable to maintain its military momentum, leading to further territorial losses. Beyond the battlefield, Ukraine's economy is deeply tied to US financial assistance. Billions of dollars have gone toward government salaries, infrastructure repairs, and energy support, helping to keep the country functional. If this aid disappears, Ukraine's government may face serious financial instability, making it even harder to sustain the war effort. Unless alternative funding sources are secured, either through increased European aid or private sector investments, Ukraine could struggle to sustain its defense. The stakes are incredibly high, and the level of US commitment in 2025 could determine Ukraine's future as a sovereign nation. From military allies to economic partners, the effects of a US aid cut to Ukraine would reach far beyond Eastern Europe. Countries like Poland, Germany, and the Baltic states could face new security threats, while Japan and Taiwan may interpret it as a shift in US global priorities. With Russia continuing its aggression, losing US aid could weaken Ukraine's ability to resist, potentially altering the course of the war. The question remains, will the US continue its support, or is a global power shift already underway? What do you think? Should the US maintain its commitment to Ukraine, or is it time for Europe to step up? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more global insights.